Good evening. This is Unit 1, Chapter 2, Lecture 2, and we're going to be looking at some of the basic building blocks of uh, American democratic ideals and the things that influenced the founders as they developed um, a government based on the ideas that they were very familiar with. But, from the time that these ideas were first established to the time that they are put into motion in the United States, approximately 500 years have passed. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta is a document that marked a decisive step forward in the development of constitutional government and legal ideas in England. It's weird, or it may seem odd, but we as Americans celebrate and consider the Magna Carta much more important than the English do. I think it's the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta this year, 2015, and that notation was much more recognized and celebrated in the United States. In Britain, it was like, yeah, we have it, we'll move on. Now, what Magna Carta means is Great Charter, and historically, it evolved around um, a situation in English history in which the king had to deal with the landed nobility, partially in order to maintain his power, probably the need for funds, and a variety of things most likely were in motion. But the English barons in June 1215 at Runnymede, which is south west of London, forced King John to approve uh, the Great Charter, or the Magna Carta. Now, in the Charter, the king granted many rights to the English aristocracy. We tend to think of it in the bigger realm of giving rights to all common Englishmen, but this is more a quid pro quo of an agreement between the royal, the king, uh, and and the aristocracy, which generated so much power and wealth, which was usually taken advantage of by the monarchy. But when we look at the bigger picture, we have to say that the Magna Carta, even though it granted many rights to the English aristocracy and far fewer rights to the common man, actually became a model for those who demanded democratic government and individual rights for all. So the Magna Carta does four things. It um, begins to evolve the concept of a constitutional government. It begins to evolve the concept of a democratic government, but make no exception here that you have to recognize that we're talking about an agreement between the king and his noble allies. There is a recognition of individual rights, things like writ of habeas corpus, produce the body, and there's the rudimentary beginnings of a legal code, which all theoretically must follow. Now, the Magna Carta contained 63 articles, and we'll look at five of them: 1, 14, 38, 61, and 63. These articles benefited the barons, they benefited other large landowners. Not everybody had a title who owned land. And in 1700, Sir William Blackstone, a famous lawyer, set down these ideals as legal rights of the people in his commentaries on the laws of England. So when we look at the first one, it says, I wrote liberties in perpetuum. What that simply meant is it reads like this: We have also granted to all free men of our kingdom, for ourselves and our heirs forever, all the liberties written below, to be had and held by them and their heirs of us and our heirs. This did is it laid the basis for freedom from unjust rule by a monarch. And certainly there have been a number of unjust monarchs in English history. 14. talks about the assessing of aid. And what that really actually says is this. It says, and to obtain the common counsel of the kingdom about the assessing of aid, or of a scutage, Scutage. What this did is it laid the basis for taxation. Scutage is the payment by individuals to another for military service. It's not a word that we would use or even recognize in today's modern English. 38 says, no bailiff shall in future put anyone to trial upon his own bare word, without reliable witnesses produced for this purpose. What this did in a very, very broad way was it laid the foundations for modern justice. And simply we use it from the perspective of one gets to face one's accusers. 38, no bailiff shall in future put anyone to trial upon screwed up here. I actually left one out. 39, which is important. It says, no free man shall be arrested or imprisoned, or deceased, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any way victimized. Neither will we attack him or send anyone to attack him, except by the lawful judgment of his peer, or by the law of the land. What 39 does, and I apologize for not putting it here, was it laid the foundations for trial by jury. 61 says, if we, or our justiciar of our bailiffs, or any one of our servants offend in any way against anyone, or transgress any of the articles of the peace or the security, and the offense by notified, 2-4 of the aforesaid 25 barons, these 4 barons shall come to us, or to our justiciar, if we are out of the kingdom, and laying the transgression before us, shall petition us to have that transgressions corrected without delay. And what that did was basically lay the foundation for the redress of grievances. You have something that bothers you about your government, you have the right to petition to have it changed. And in 63, wherefore we wish and firmly enjoin that the English church shall be free, and that the men in our kingdom shall have and hold all the aforesaid liberties, rights, and concessions, well and peacefully, freely and quietly, full and completely, for themselves and for their errors from us, and our errors in all manners and in all places forever, as is aforesaid. And what this did was lay the basis for limited government and a written charter, a forerunner of the Constitution, or of a Constitution. So those are 6 important elements in the Magna Carta, and much of it, though we've changed the language, much of those concepts in some way are in the Constitution as one of our rights. Now the next step occurs 300 some odd years later. As English law evolved, and there were battles and changes in royal family. In 1628, the early 17th century, there developed what we call the Petition of Rights, or the Petition of Right. And it was sent in 1628 to Charles I by the English Parliament. And it was a statement of civil liberties. And what was occurring at the time, it was a battle of wills between Parliament and Charles I. And Parliament was refusing to finance, by raising taxes, the king's unpopular foreign policy. And what was happening was that the king and his government were forcing loans and quartering troops in subjects' homes because it was, at least for the government, good economics. It was ruinous for the general population. But the king was using the forced loans and the quartering as an economy measure. So the Petition of Right was initiated by Sir Edward Coke, spelled just like Coke, C-O-K-E. And this Petition of Right was based upon earlier statutes and charters and asserted four principles. First, no taxes may be levied without consent of Parliament. Secondly, no subject may be imprisoned without cause. Third, no soldiers may be quartered upon the citizenry. And four, martial law may not be used in times of peace. Don't you think the British forgot a little bit about this when they dealt with the American colonies in the 18th century, especially the imposition upon Americans by quartering troops, and also some colonies had people imprisoned without cause. And of course, the rallying cry, taxation without representation, which is a little bit different than no taxes levied, but certainly if you're going to pay taxes, you want to have a say. So all of these were kind of developing a roadmap for how Americans would deal with what they considered a tyrannical system. Now, in June 1628, Charles I capitulated, and he was granted subsidies in return for recognition of the Petition of Right. Now, although Charles I accepted the petition in exchange for those subsidies, he continued to collect duties without Parliament's authorization. And he prosecuted citizens in a very arbitrary manner. He was obviously not the most popular man on the block, but he was the English king. So when we look at the Petition of Right, there's three major strains of change that we have to acknowledge. First, the Petition of Right evolved the concept of limited government, that government has limitations as to how it can act. Two, it evolved the concept of consent to taxation, that people should vote or in some manner give their consent through their representatives that they are in favor of paying higher taxes in order to support whatever it is the government would like to accomplish. Third, there evolved the concept of no quartering of troops among the general population, which certainly was a strongly felt train of thought among people not only in England but also in the colonies. Now, as we begin to wrap this up, in very broad ways, I've laid out the purposes of government. Now, we know from start at 1 o'clock, keeping a strong government is not an easy task. It just isn't. And government continually has to convince individuals that they need to follow the rules. Because when you don't follow the rules, the result is chaos and anarchy. Politicians, if they're skilled, can use their skills to see that the purposes of government are fulfilled. Infrastructure, safety net like Social Security, all those things are a government purpose in the modern view. At 7 o'clock, we have leaders must keep in mind the reasons government exists. So they have to keep telling themselves in a limited way, this is what we're responsible for, and we need to push the population in order to accomplish those goals. We seem to, at least in the United States, lost this next statement at 9 o'clock. Successful leaders and politicians often maintain or gain control by developing good relationships with the people, and must persuade one group to see the viewpoint of the other. And the fact of the matter is, we're not doing that very well here in the United States. We have gridlock. No one wants to compromise because they can't see the point of the other. And so nothing gets done. And finally, at 11 o'clock, politics is the method or tactic involved in managing government and gaining power. In a very simple way. Those are the 6 purposes of government. And if we narrow it down even further, there's 5 things that government does. Number 1, protection. Number 2, the maintenance of public order. Number 3, the resolution of public conflicts. Number 4, the responsibility for a stable economy. And number 5, a provision of public service. Those are the purposes. When you narrow it down and you filter it down to its essence, those are the 5 purposes of government. So this ends this lecture. I've tried to keep it as short as possible. Again, this is not discussed in a strong way in Chapter 2 in the Lineberry, but it's stuff that we have to acknowledge. So this ends Lecture 2.